Europe in 1936. Hitler had been in power for 3 years. Mussolini had ruled Italy since 1922. In Russia, Stalin had begun the show trials and purges of his enemies. Democracy everywhere was on the defensive. Britain and France were fearful of a European war. Then came the news from Spain.
All is turmoil in turbulent Spain, and the cost of political anarchy is death and destruction. This unhappy country, reft into two almost equal camps, illustrates all the tragedies of civil war under modern conditions. Innocent people lose their lives, property of law-abiding citizens is wrecked, and half the combatants fight half-heartedly for one cause or the other because they are forced to take sides. Such is the fruit of anarchy, of a people divided against itself.
The newsreels, as usual, had a simple explanation: anarchy. But in truth, Spain's crisis confused many an outsider. To understand it, they translated the peculiarly Spanish issues into their own. Spain became Europe's obsession. Immediately, both sides sought and found gestures of support from rival sponsors abroad. In the liberal democratic world, individual sympathy for the plight of the Spanish Republic was widespread, but practical help from governments was to prove a different matter. The army rebels' pleas, on the other hand, were soon answered. Franco was not, at that time at least, a fascist. He was a conservative monarchist, but he was immediately assisted by European dictators who were fascists, and so he was inevitably identified with their kind of political despotism. Nevertheless, there is no evidence of any international fascist complicity in the Spanish general's original coup. On the contrary, in the summer of 1936, Hitler's thoughts were far from Spain. He was building a war machine for his own purposes: expansion in the east and the repression of his opponents inside Germany. Hitler promised Britain that Germany wouldn't get involved in Spain. It was the first example of double talk in the Civil War, saying one thing and doing the opposite. Hitler had already sent aid. 2 days after the Spanish uprising, Franco had appealed to the Führer for help. After considering the consequence of a communist-influenced government controlling the Strait of Gibraltar, Hitler decided to send not the few anti-aircraft guns and fighters that Franco had asked for, but a full squadron of Junkers transport planes to airlift the Spanish Army of Africa from Morocco. "1,500 of these troops were transported to Seville to begin their fighting passage to Madrid. These crack troops of the Spanish army were to play a decisive role in the war. Hitler said later that Franco should erect a monument to the Junkers 52, the aircraft that Franco had to thank for his victory. Hitler might have congratulated himself too. His help was later rewarded with a constant supply of Spanish iron ore. This gave him a great advantage in his preparations for the World War that was to follow. But in 1936, most people still thought that war could be avoided.
Noi crediamo che l'Italia.
In 1936, Mussolini had not yet become Hitler's pawn.
Inquadrata in tutte le sue formazioni rivoluzionarie.
Indeed, many British hoped Italy could become an ally.
I suoi destini.
But Mussolini's conquest of Abyssinia had already shown that he was preparing aggressive expansion.
Alla potenza e alla gloria.
He wanted to turn the Mediterranean into what he called Mare Nostrum, our sea, another Italian lake. There was a natural challenge at the entrance to that lake. Throughout the 30s, Mussolini had dabbled with small-scale right-wing plots to subvert Spanish democracy. He had modestly financed the leader of Spain's fascist party, José Antonio, and allowed right-wing military groups to train on Italian soil. In 1934, In a written though informal agreement, Mussolini had promised to supply arms to Spanish monarchist conspirators should they overthrow the Republic. When the time came, after the uprising, he supplied 12 bombers, the first foreign military hardware to arrive in Spain's war. While Germany and Italy supported the army rebels, Léon Blum, the French Prime Minister of the recently elected Popular Front government, naturally identified with the Republican government of Spain. Léon Blum feared France's isolation. Still haunted by the terrible French losses in the 1914-18 war, and already flanked by 2 fascist powers, France certainly did not want to be trapped in a fascist triangle. Blum went to London to discuss plans for a collective security treaty with the British. Before he went, he ordered that arms be sent to Spain. At this meeting with Anthony Eden, the British Foreign Secretary, Spain was not officially on the agenda, but Blum discussed it anyway. Conservative Prime Minister Baldwin and his ministers were concerned at all costs to avoid another world war and feared it could start in Spain. Britain's attitude didn't help the French Prime Minister Léon Blum. His plan for keeping European peace by protecting Spain was also in trouble at home. His policy of unrestricted military sales had threatened to split his government and might have precipitated serious civil unrest. He therefore reversed his original decision to send arms to Spain and devised another policy to save his face. On August 2nd, the French cabinet announced that they had decided to appeal urgently to interested governments for a pact of non-intervention. The British government, supported at this stage by its Labour opposition, responded eagerly. As France closed its borders, the Spanish Republic felt let down. Under international law, it was legally entitled to buy arms abroad, but non-intervention stopped that. No one had ever claimed heroic intention for the policy. It was a diplomatic stratagem, a framework in which everyone could safely pursue their individual ends. They would fight their battles without actually going to war. No one thought it could curtail hostilities in Spain, or even that it should. Spain provided a safety valve to siphon off the political passions of Europe at that time. Now Pasionaria, whose real name was Dolores Ibarruri, was a communist member of the Spanish Parliament. Her rhetoric rallied worldwide support for the Republic. In Germany, communists had been the first target of Hitler's terror, and so when Hitler made clear his support for Franco, German communists knew which side they were on. The politics of economic depression spilled over from the cities of Europe to a full-scale battlefield in Spain. It was mainly communists who traveled to do the fighting. The call came from Moscow. The International Committee of Communist Leaders, a Comintern, organized an international column of volunteers. Stalin himself, however, had his doubts. He was wooing Britain and France as allies against the Nazi threat and didn't want them scared off by communist intervention in Spain. He held back from sending arms. He did send advisors, ambassadors, and food. When the first Russian ship arrived in Barcelona, initial rapture gave way to disappointment when the consignment turned out to be not the guns that the Republic wanted, but canned milk. The guns only came later. Meanwhile, the Italian Foreign Minister Ciano met Hitler at Berchtesgaden in Germany. They agreed that their aid to the Spanish army rebels had to be increased, partly to counter Russian aid, and partly because Hitler had now decided he wanted to go over to the attack against the democracies. What had previously been a reflex action, a decision to supply Spain on request, became a concrete policy, a joint front against communism. A few days after Ciano and Hitler's meeting, Mussolini was heard for the first time to refer to the Rome-Berlin axis. Events in Spain had drawn Italy and Germany closer together. a step down the path towards the Second World War.
I hate war.
The world was very different in 1936. America was not the fulcrum of the world's foreign policy decisions. Still in dogged isolation from Europe's affairs, Roosevelt ignored the Spanish conflict and allowed the Texas Oil Company to supply Franco with fuel. In London, the non-intervention powers examined allegations of Italian, German and Portuguese intervention. The committee was chaired by the British. No one wanted the charges to stick, and they didn't. Von Ribbentrop, the German ambassador, later joked, a more appropriate name for the organization would have been the Intervention Committee. Nowhere was this intervention clearer than in the battle for Madrid. Until October, the skies were dominated by the rebels, reinforced by German and Italian planes. The Spanish Republican Air Force was no match until Soviet planes arrived. Just 15 weeks after the start of the war, the Republic's capital, Madrid, was on the front line. The rest of the Republic lay behind. The army rebels held the territory north and west of the capital. Their land offensive began on November 7th. With only 25,000 men, the Nationalists were attempting to capture a city of 1 million inhabitants. Franco had made ready lists of people to be arrested. Having met little resistance so far, he could not have anticipated the stubborn reaction of the Madrid people. No Pasaran, they shall not pass, had become the slogan of Madrid, and indeed of all Republican Spain. The government under Largo Caballero left the capital for the safety of Valencia. So did many of the population. For those who stayed, some preparation to defend the city had already been made. General Miaca, one of the army officers who stayed loyal to the Republic, led the defense junta in charge of the overall political and military control of Madrid. Everyone in Madrid was involved. Loyal officers staffed the army. Ordinary people built defenses for the city. Political parties recruited men for defense militias. But most of all, an organized army was created. However barely trained and equipped, 10 new brigades of the popular army of regular soldiers, mixed with volunteers, were naturally a more effective fighting force than the old militia columns. The people's resistance was stiffened by the approach of Franco's troops and by potent propaganda.
Madrid, corazón de España, late con pulsos de fiebre. Si ayer la sangre le hervía, hoy con más calor le hierve. Ya nunca podrá dormirse, porque si Madrid se duerme, querrá despertarse un día y el alba no vendrá a verle. No olvides, Madrid, la guerra. Jamás olvides que enfrente los ojos del enemigo te echan miradas de muerte. Rondan por tu cielo halcones que precipitarse quieren sobre tus rojos tejados, tus calles, tu brava gente.